There's a tile at the entrance of Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home. It's small, mosaic, easy to miss if you're not looking. But the words etched into it have haunted historians for decades. Cursum Perficio, Latin, ancient. Roughly translated, it means, the journey ends here. When Marilyn bought the house in early 1962, did she know what those words meant? Did she choose them herself, or were they already there waiting, like a prophecy she couldn't escape? 6 months after she moved in, Marilyn Monroe was dead. The journey had indeed ended, but 60 years later, the house itself faced its own death sentence. New owners, a demolition permit, plans to tear it down and build something bigger, newer, more profitable. The tile would be gone. The house would be gone. Marilyn's last refuge would become a construction site, unless the city could stop it, and that's exactly what they tried to do. What happened next became one of the most controversial preservation fights in Hollywood history, a battle between private property rights and public memory, where a 12-0 city council vote wasn't enough to end the war. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you want to hear more untold Hollywood secrets and conspiracies, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. New videos every week. 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive. The address doesn't sound particularly special. It's tucked away in Brentwood, one of Los Angeles's wealthiest neighborhoods, where privacy is currency and real estate prices defy gravity. The house itself is modest by modern standards, a single-story hacienda-style structure with white stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and a small swimming pool out back. Nothing flashy, nothing screaming for attention, which is exactly why Marilyn Monroe wanted it. By early 1962, Marilyn had been living out of hotel rooms, guest houses, and borrowed spaces for most of her adult life. She'd been married 3 times to James Dougherty, Joe DiMaggio, Arthur Miller, and all 3 marriages had ended. She'd been passed between studio apartments and rented mansions, never quite settling, never quite belonging anywhere. The closest thing she had to stability was her psychiatrist's couch. But now, for the first time in her life, she wanted a home, not a set, not a rental, a home, something that was hers and hers alone. She found it in February 1962. The asking price was $75,000, which wasn't cheap by early 60s standards, but it was manageable for a woman who'd been Hollywood's biggest box office draw for nearly a decade. The house sat on less than half an acre, surrounded by eucalyptus trees and bougainvillea. It had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a living room with exposed wooden beams that gave it a rustic, almost European feel. There was a fireplace, a small guest house, a brick patio overlooking the pool, and that tile, that strange, ominous tile at the front entrance, embedded in the doorstep like a warning no one bothered to read. Marilyn moved in during the spring of 1962. She bought Mexican furniture, heavy wooden chairs, woven rugs, pottery from Tijuana markets. She hung paintings. She planted flowers. She talked about getting a dog. For someone who'd spent her entire life being watched, photographed, and consumed by the public, this was supposed to be her sanctuary. The place where Norma Jean could breathe without the weight of Marilyn Monroe crushing her lungs. But sanctuary is a fragile thing, and by summer, the house had become something else entirely. The phone calls started coming at odd hours. Reporters camped outside the gate. Photographers with telephoto lenses perched in the trees. The neighbors complained about the noise, the traffic, the constant circus that followed Marilyn wherever she went. Inside the house, things were falling apart. Her last film, Something's Got to Give, had been a disaster. 20th Century Fox fired her in June, claiming she was unprofessional, unreliable, impossible to work with. Her relationships were collapsing. Her dependency on prescription pills, barbiturates, sedatives, sleeping aids was spiraling out of control. And on the night of August 4th, 1962, something happened inside that house, something that ended Marilyn Monroe's journey exactly where the tile said it would. The official story was suicide, an overdose of Nembutal and chloral hydrate. The coroner ruled it probable suicide, though no suicide note was ever found. But almost immediately, questions began to surface. Why were there no pill bottles in the bedroom where she died? Why did the timeline of the housekeeper's story keep changing? Why were the phone records from that night missing? And why, within hours of her death, did FBI agents arrive at the house and begin removing documents, files, and personal belongings that were never seen again? The house on Fifth Helena Drive became more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol, a question mark, a tomb that refused to stay silent. But here's what most people don't know. After Marilyn's death, the house didn't become a museum. It didn't become a landmark. It didn't even become a tourist attraction. It was sold, and then sold again, and again, and again. Over the next 60 years, the house changed hands 14 times. Each new owner renovated, expanded, modernized. The original layout was altered. Walls were moved. The pool was resurfaced. The guest house was rebuilt. By the time Brenna Milstein and Roy Bank purchased the property in July 2023, almost nothing remained of the house Marilyn had known, except the tile, that cursed prophetic tile, still there, still waiting at the door. But Milstein and Bank didn't buy the house because of Marilyn Monroe. They bought it because of the lot next door. In Brentwood, real estate isn't sentimental, it's strategic. And when you own two adjacent parcels in one of the most expensive zip codes in America, the math is simple. Demolish the smaller house, merge the properties, build something spectacular, and watch your investment multiply overnight. It happens all the time. Tear down the old, build the new. That's how wealth compounds in Los Angeles. But this wasn't just any old house. This was Marilyn Monroe's house. And that tile at the entrance, it was about to spark a war. The demolition permit was filed quietly. No press release, no public announcement, just paperwork moving through the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety like it did for thousands of other properties every year. Milstein and Bank had followed the rules. They'd hired architects, submitted plans, paid the fees. Everything was in order. The permit was approved. The wrecking crew was scheduled, and then someone noticed. It's unclear who leaked the story first. Maybe it was a city employee who recognized the address. Maybe it was a neighbor who saw the demolition notice posted on the gate. Maybe it was a preservation activist who'd been monitoring the property for years, waiting for exactly this moment. But by September 2023, the news was out. Marilyn Monroe's house was going to be demolished. And the internet exploded. Within days, emails flooded the office of Los Angeles City Council member Traci Park, whose district included Brentwood, hundreds at first, then thousands, preservationists, historians, Marilyn fans from across the country and around the world. The message was unanimous. You cannot let them tear down that house. Phone calls jammed the lines, social media campaigns erupted, petitions circulated. The outrage wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about principle. This was the only house Marilyn Monroe had ever owned, the place where she spent her final months, the place where she died under circumstances that still fuel conspiracy theories 60 years later. How could the city allow it to be erased? Traci Park knew she had to act fast. The demolition crew wasn't far behind, so on September 26, 2023, she filed an application with the city's Office of Historic Resources to designate the property as a historic cultural monument. It was a legal maneuver designed to freeze the demolition and force a public hearing. Under Los Angeles Municipal Code, once an HCM application is filed, the property owner cannot proceed with demolition until the case is reviewed by the Cultural Heritage Commission, the Planning Commission, and ultimately the City Council. It's a lengthy process, and that was exactly the point. Park was buying time. But Milstein and Bank weren't about to sit back and wait. They hired lawyers. They issued statements. They argued that the house, after 60 years and 14 owners and countless renovations, no longer qualified as a historic structure. The original floor plan had been altered. The interiors had been gutted and rebuilt. Even the exterior had been modified. What was left of Marilyn's house? They pointed to the municipal code's own criteria. To qualify as a historic cultural monument, a property must embody the distinctive characteristics of a style, type, period, or method of construction, or be associated with the lives of significant persons in a manner that has historical or cultural significance. Their argument was simple. This house had been so heavily modified that it no longer met either standard. It was just a Brentwood property with a famous address. The preservationists fired back. The Los Angeles Conservancy, one of the city's most influential preservation organizations, issued a statement supporting landmark designation. They argued that the house's historical significance wasn't tied to its architectural features, it was tied to Marilyn Monroe herself. This was the place where she lived, however briefly, the place where she died, the place where her story ended, and that alone made it worth saving. Op-eds appeared in the Los Angeles Times, historians weighed in, architectural critics debated the definition of authenticity, and all the while the clock was ticking. By January 2024, the case had moved through the Cultural Heritage Commission. The commissioners voted to recommend landmark status. Next stop, the Planning Commission. Same result, recommendation approved. Now it was heading to the final battleground, the Los Angeles City Council. But before the council could vote, Milstein and Bank made their move. In May 2024, they filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, claiming that the landmark designation process had been conducted in violation of their constitutional rights. The lawsuit alleged that city officials had engaged in what they called backroom machinations, secret meetings, politically motivated decisions, procedural shortcuts, all designed to strip them of their property rights without due process. It was a bold accusation, and it set the stage for a courtroom showdown. The lawsuit landed on the desk of Los Angeles Superior Court Judge James C. Chalfant, and Chalfant was not impressed. In a preliminary hearing, the judge reviewed the homeowner's request for an injunction that would halt the landmark designation process and allow them to proceed with demolition. Chalfant called it an ill-disguised attempt to demolish the house. He denied the injunction. The message was clear. If you want to tear down Marilyn Monroe's house, you're going to have to prove your case in open court. And proving it wasn't going to be easy. June 26, 2024. The Los Angeles City Council chamber was packed. Preservationists filled the gallery. News cameras lined the walls. Traci Park stood at the podium, ready to present the case for landmark designation. Across the aisle, representatives for Milstein and Bank prepared to argue against it. The debate was fierce. Park's team emphasized the cultural and historical significance of the property. They presented testimony from Marilyn Monroe scholars, biographers, and Hollywood historians. They played archival footage of Marilyn moving into the house, smiling for the cameras, talking about finally having a place of her own. They cited the thousands of emails and phone calls from constituents who wanted the house preserved. They argued that some places transcend private property, they belong to the public memory. The opposition countered with facts. They brought in architects and contractors who testified about the extent of the renovations. They showed blueprints comparing the 1962 floor plan to the current one. They presented photographs documenting the changes. They argued that the house no longer bore any meaningful resemblance to the structure Marilyn had known. They invoked property rights. They invoked economic liberty. They invoked the principle that government should not be able to seize private property, even symbolically, without compelling justification. And they pointed out something that many people didn't want to hear. Marilyn Monroe had lived in the house for less than 6 months. She'd spent more time in hotels. Was 6 months really enough to justify landmark status? Others were unmoved, but when the vote finally came, it wasn't close, 12-0. The Los Angeles City Council unanimously designated 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive as Historic Cultural Monument number 1294. The house was saved, the demolition was blocked, and the crowd in the gallery erupted in applause, but the homeowners weren't done. Their lawyers immediately announced plans to continue the lawsuit. They argued that the council's vote didn't change the fundamental constitutional issues at stake. They claimed the process had been tainted by political pressure and public hysteria. They vowed to fight the designation in court, and Judge Chalfant, who was still overseeing the case, would ultimately have to decide whether the city's actions were legally sound or constitutionally suspect. And here's where the story gets even stranger. Because even after the landmark designation, even after the council vote, even after the courthouse drama, the controversy didn't end. In fact, it got worse. Tour buses started showing up on Fifth Helena Drive. Marilyn fans, conspiracy theorists, curiosity seekers. They lined the street, taking photographs, peering through the gates, leaving flowers and handwritten notes on the curb. The neighbors complained. The homeowners complained. and the city found itself in the bizarre position of having to protect a landmark that was now causing a public nuisance. By late 2024, city officials were discussing the possibility of restricting tour bus access to the street. Some residents wanted the entire block closed to commercial traffic. Others suggested turning the house into a museum, though no one could agree on who would fund it or how it would operate. And through it all, Milstein and Bank remained trapped in legal limbo, owning a house they couldn't demolish, couldn't renovate, and couldn't sell without disclosing that it was now a city landmark subject to historic preservation restrictions. The property they'd bought as an investment had become a liability, and the tile at the entrance, Cursum Perficio, seemed more prophetic than ever. September 2025, Judge James C. Chalfant issued his ruling. The homeowners had asked the court to strip the house of its landmark status, arguing that the designation process had been legally flawed and unconstitutional. Chalfant rejected their claims. In his written opinion, he found that the city had followed proper procedures, that the council's vote had been legitimate, and that the homeowners had failed to demonstrate any constitutional violation. The landmark designation stood. The house would remain protected, and Milstein and Bank's legal options were running out. So what does this all mean? Is this a victory for historic preservation or an overreach of government power? Does a city have the right to declare your private property a public monument just because someone famous died there? And if the house has been so heavily renovated that almost nothing remains of the original structure, is it really Marilyn Monroe's house anymore? Or is it just a symbol, a tile at the entrance, a story we tell ourselves, a way of keeping the past alive even when the past is gone? These questions don't have easy answers, but they reveal something important about how we think about history, memory, and ownership. Because this case wasn't really about a house. It was about what we owe to the dead. It was about whether cultural heritage can trump private property rights. It was about the tension between nostalgia and progress, between the people who want to preserve the past and the people who want to profit from the present. Marilyn Monroe never intended for her house to become a landmark. She bought it because she wanted privacy, she wanted peace, she wanted a place where she could be Norma Jean instead of Marilyn Monroe. But the world wouldn't let her have that, not in life, and apparently not in death either. The house became famous because she died there. And now, 60 years later, it remains famous for the same reason. The tile at the entrance was right all along. The journey ended there. But the story never ends. In the end, the city of Los Angeles made a choice. They decided that some places are too important to erase, that some stories need to be preserved, even if the physical structures that house them have changed beyond recognition. They decided that Marilyn Monroe's house, whatever remains of it, belongs not just to the people who own the deed, but to the people who remember the woman who lived there. And whether you agree with that choice or not, it raises a question we'll be asking for generations: who owns a legend's last home? The people who bought it, or the people who loved her? If this story made you think, leave a comment below. Do you think the city made the right call? Should private property rights come first, or does cultural heritage matter more? Let's discuss. And if you want more untold Hollywood stories, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.